The poor housekeeper. She protected the millionaire's mother from a slap. The revenge that followed was incredible. No one in that gilded ballroom expected it would be the housekeeper, the one in the gray apron with calloused hands, who would dare to stop the hand of the most influential man in the city. But what came next shook the very foundations of his empire. The ballroom of Vance Manor that night was the closest thing to paradise Valerie Davis had seen in her 26 years of life. 400 white candles burned, suspended in crystal chandeliers that hung from the ceiling like constellations trapped in glass. The flowers, gardenias, white roses, ivory orchids, filled the air with a perfume so dense you could almost chew it. The tables were draped with embroidered linen cloths, and on them gleamed fine crystal stemware that caught the light and returned it in tiny rainbows. Valerie wasn't a guest. She never had been. She was part of the invisible landscape that made such beauty possible. The one who arranged the centerpieces before the owners arrived. The one who collected empty glasses before anyone noticed them. The one who existed on the edges of others' luxury without ever truly touching it. She had been working at Vance Manor for 4 months. 4 months learning the marble hallways, the names of the rooms, the preferences of each member of that distant and complicated family. 4 months observing, staying silent, smiling when necessary, and disappearing when most convenient. That night, however, something in the air felt different. It was the 50th wedding anniversary of the late Edward Vance, who had passed away 3 years prior, and Eleanor, his widow, had insisted on celebrating anyway. Edward would have wanted it this way, she had said in that soft but firm voice Valerie had come to deeply respect. He loved gatherings. He loved seeing the family together, and I won't let his absence erase what we built. Eleanor was 74, her hair completely white, pulled back in an elegant bun, and amber eyes that still held the clarity of someone who had lived well and with intention. That night, she wore a taupe-tailored suit with delicate gold details on the cuffs, discreet, expensive, full of dignity, and walked leaning on a dark wood cane that looked more like a scepter than a medical necessity. Valerie admired her in silence. It was hard not to. Mrs. Vance had been kind to her from day one. When Valerie arrived in her new uniform, still creased from the package, nerves etched on her jaw, "Don't freeze up on me, girl," Eleanor had told her with a mischievous smile. "Heavy burdens are the only thing that can truly hurt you here." And she had laughed at her own joke, with a genuine laugh that went straight to Valerie's chest. But the Vances weren't just Eleanor. There were her children. Richard Vance was 33, the kind of face society magazines called attractive with a capital A, and a smile Valerie had learned to read with precision from the first week. When it was real, which rarely happened, it was charming. When it was fake, which happened almost always, it had the edge of a surgeon's scalpel. He was the second son, the one who had stayed in the city while his older brother went abroad, the one who managed the family businesses since his father's death, the one who signed the checks and made the decisions and called meetings with the lawyers. And he was also the one who treated his mother as if she were an administrative problem awaiting resolution. Valerie had noticed it from the beginning with that observational capacity developed by those who must read the room before speaking. The tense silences at breakfast, the instructions Richard gave about the house without consulting Eleanor, the documents that appeared on her desk with a pen on top, and an implicit pressure. The way he sometimes looked at her when he thought no one was watching, with barely disguised impatience, like someone waiting to inherit something they've considered theirs for too long. That night the tension was denser than the gardenia perfume. Valerie perceived it as she circulated among the guests with her tray of glasses, maintaining correct posture, the right smile, attentive eyes. She had learned to move like this, present without being noticed, useful without being remembered. It was an art she had perfected in years of work, since she was 14, when she started cleaning houses in her neighborhood, through 16 when she got her first formal job in a high-end restaurant in downtown Manhattan, until 22 when she entered domestic service in high-status homes. She knew that world better than many of its inhabitants. The gathering had started well. Guests arrived, punctually business owners, old family friends, some low-profile politicians Valerie recognized from the news. And Eleanor greeted them all with that quiet grace only found in people who have shaken hands with the same kind of individuals for 50 years. Richard was by her side for the first 2 hours, smiling the right smile, giving the precise hugs, being the host the occasion demanded. But at 10 o'clock that night, something changed. Valerie didn't know what came first. Perhaps the third whiskey Richard poured for himself without being offered. Perhaps the call he received that took him out of the ballroom for 20 minutes, jaw clenched, Perhaps some conversation he overheard that twisted his mood in a way that alcohol then amplified. What was certain was that when he returned to the ballroom, he was a different person. Valerie saw him look for his mother among the groups of guests. He found her talking with Mr. Arthur Davies, a longtime family attorney, near the main window. Eleanor's face was animated, her hands moving as she told a story, probably about Edward, about a trip or an early project, and her voice reached them in warm fragments above the music. Richard approached in a straight line, without stopping to greet, without waiting. "Mother," he said in a voice that aimed for discretion, but which Valerie heard perfectly from where she stood, about 20 feet away. "I need to speak with you now." Eleanor raised a gentle hand without interrupting her conversation. "In a moment, son, let me finish with Arthur." It was that gesture, that small gesture of asking him to wait, so natural, so human, that ignited something in Richard. "I said now," he repeated, and this time his voice didn't pretend to be anything. It was an order. "Mr. Davies took a discreet step back. The first territory ceded that night. Eleanor turned to her son, with an expression that blended patience with something harder, deeper. "Richard, I am in my home, at my party, speaking with my friend. You can wait 5 minutes." What happened next lasted less than 3 seconds. Valerie saw it all with a clarity that time would never erase. Richard's jaw tensing, the crystal glass clutched in his right hand until his knuckles went white. The moment his arm began to move fast, determined, in the unmistakable arc of someone about to strike, she didn't think. Thought came later, when it was too late to regret. Her hand moved before her brain gave any instruction. She dropped the tray. The glasses clinked but didn't fall, miraculously balanced on a nearby small table. And she took 2 quick steps, and her palm closed around Richard's wrist at the exact point where the speed of the blow was maximal. She stopped it in midair. The entire ballroom froze. It wasn't a gradual silence, one of those that grows as people slowly notice something is happening. It was immediate and total, as if someone had turned off the sound with a switch. The music continued. The string quartet in the corner took 3 more measures to realize it, but all conversations, all laughter, all movements stopped at once. All eyes were oriented towards that point in the ballroom, where a young woman in a gray apron held Richard Vance's hand in the air. Valerie didn't let go. She looked him directly in the eyes. There was no rage in her expression. Rage was a luxury she had learned not to afford. But there was something that was perhaps harder to bear. An absolute calm, without apology, without fear, without the slightest hint that she intended to move. Richard looked at her as if he couldn't quite process what he was seeing, as if the entire universe had made a fundamental logical error, and he was the only one who had noticed. A housekeeper was holding his arm in his own home, in front of 400 candles and 80 guests and his father's portrait hanging above the fireplace. "Release me," he said so softly that only Valerie, Eleanor, and Mr. Davies heard him. Valerie didn't move. "Release me," he repeated. And this time his voice had something different, the specific texture of someone trying not to explode in public. "Gladly," Valerie said in a low but clear voice, "when you lower your arm." Eleanor, beside her, said nothing. Her hand was resting on Valerie's forearm, not to push her away, but like someone touching another to thank them for something words can't express, and her amber eyes were fixed on her son with an expression Valerie couldn't fully decipher. It was sadness, yes, but also something older and harder. It was the recognition of something she perhaps had known for a long time, and that night it had simply acquired a name. Richard lowered his arm. Valerie released him. For a moment, no one in the room breathed. It was the string quartet that broke the silence, resuming the melody with the clumsiness of musicians who don't know what else to do. Then came the murmurs, first soft, then more audible, and the sound of glasses being picked up and conversations restarting with that nervous energy people have when they've witnessed something they don't yet know how to comment on. Richard did not look at his mother again. He looked at Valerie, and in that long, cold gaze, stripped of all the social layers he had worn all night, he told her with absolute clarity what would come next. They weren't words, they were a promise. Valerie received it without blinking, because in 4 months of working in that house, she had learned many things about the Vances, and one of the most important was that men like Richard neither forgot nor forgave. But also, and this was what he still didn't know about her, they didn't forgive those who were in the right. Eleanor gently squeezed Valerie's arm once more before turning to her guests with a serene smile, as if nothing had happened, as if the entire world hadn't just taken a small but irreversible turn. "Anyone for champagne?" she said in a perfectly steady voice. and Valerie picked up her tray from the floor, arranged the miraculously unbroken glasses, and returned to her work with perfectly steady hands and her heart beating at 200. Valerie didn't sleep that night. It wasn't exactly fear that kept her eyes open. Or not times, just times fear. It was that strange clarity that sometimes comes after doing something irreversible, the certainty that the world that existed before that moment no longer exists, and the new one doesn't yet have a name or definite form, a luminous and terrifying limbo at the same time. Her room was small and in the service wing, on the 3rd floor of the manor, 4 square meters with a single bed, a light wood nightstand, a narrow closet, and a window overlooking the back garden. Through that window came the smell of wet earth and wild jasmine, and on other nights, that smell calmed her. Not tonight. She lay on her back with her eyes open, listening to the sounds of the house gradually emptying. The last guest saying goodbye, the steps of the staff collecting the final remnants of the party, the voice of Mrs. Holloway, the head of staff, giving instructions in the hallway in that low, efficient tone she had even at midnight. Then silence, and in the silence, the waiting. Valerie knew enough about the world to know that Richard Vance was not one to let things slide. She had observed him for 4 months with that sustained attention which is both a privilege and a necessity for those who work close to power. Employers rarely notice their staff, but staff always notice their employers. She had seen how Richard treated suppliers who failed to deliver, employees who made mistakes, partners who dared to contradict him in meetings. She had seen that jaw clench, that voice become both lower and sharper, that smile transform into something that had the times shape, times of a smile, but none of its properties. She knew what was coming, she just didn't know when. The answer arrived at 7 a.m. Valerie had managed to fall asleep only a couple of hours before dawn, and the knock on the door, 3 dry knocks, without waiting, woke her with her heart already racing before her brain finished processing where she was. She dressed quickly, with calmer hands than she expected, and opened it. It was Mark, one of Richard's assistants, young, serious, with that expression of someone who follows orders without taking responsibility for them. "Mr. Vance is waiting for you in his study," he said, without a good morning, without anything else. "I'll be right there," Valerie replied. Richard's study was on the ground floor, at the end of the main corridor, a large room with dark wood walls, a library that covered the entire back wall, and a solid oak desk that served as a trench. Richard was standing when Valerie entered, not sitting, which she interpreted as a deliberate decision. Standing, one has more height, more presence, more command of the space. She looked at him without lowering her eyes. He looked at her without any of the layers he had worn the previous night. In the morning light, without the alcohol and without the guests, Richard was more intimidating than in the gilded ballroom. Not because he yelled he didn't yell, but precisely because he didn't. His voice, when he spoke, was perfectly controlled, almost cordial, with that specific coldness of those who have learned that a quiet tone scares more than a loud one. "Do you know why you're here?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I suppose so," Valerie replied. "Good." He took 2 steps around the desk, without getting too close. "What happened last night was unacceptable. You took a liberty that does not belong to you, in an area that is not your concern, in front of people whose opinion matters. That cannot be overlooked." Valerie waited. "Your contract ends today," Richard continued. "We will pay you for the full month, even though you technically haven't worked it. It's more than you deserve, but I prefer things to be resolved in an orderly fashion. Mark will help you collect your belongings." The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds. "Do you have anything to say?" Richard asked with the tone of someone who truly expected no answer. "Yes," said Valerie. He blinked almost imperceptibly. "What I did last night, I would do again," she said, and her voice did not tremble. "If someone raises their hand against an elderly person, against anyone, and I am near, I will intervene, no matter who is raising their hand." Richard watched her for a long moment, the kind of moment where you can see someone deciding which version of themselves to show. "Interesting," he said finally. "Save that bravery for your next job, if you manage to get one. You may leave." Valerie nodded once, and left. In the hallway, with the door closed behind her, she took a deep breath and let her heartbeats find their rhythm again. Her knees weren't trembling, which was a good sign. Her hands weren't either. Good. She went up to her room and began to fold her clothes in silence. What Richard didn't account for was his mother. Eleanor learned of the situation at 8:30 a.m. Mrs. Holloway, who had been in that house for 22 years and had her own loyalties very clearly distributed, informed her while bringing her breakfast tea. Valerie was still packing when she heard footsteps in the hallway. The cane first, then the shoes. A rhythm she now recognized perfectly. The door opened without a prior knock. Eleanor entered the small room with the same presence she would have entered a ballroom. She looked at the semi-open suitcase on the bed. She looked at Valerie, who had paused with a folded shirt in her hands. "Leave that," she said. "Ma'am," I said, "leave that." Valerie put down the shirt. Eleanor closed the door behind her and sat on the edge of the bed. The only chair was occupied by the suitcase, with the precise calm of someone who has made a decision and is only verifying the details are in order. "Did my son tell you you were leaving?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you told him yes?" Valerie hesitated. "Not exactly, but what other option do I have? He's the one who manages the house." Eleanor raised a hand with a small, definitive gesture. "This house is called Vance because my husband built it, with my name included, and as long as I'm alive, no one in it signs a single dismissal order without my knowledge and approval." She paused briefly. "I don't approve." Valerie looked at her. "Ma'am, with all due respect, Mr. Richard is going to—" "Mr. Richard," Eleanor interrupted in a tone that had the specific texture of someone who has been swallowing something for a long time, "is going to learn that there's a difference between managing a family's businesses and managing the family itself." She stood up with the help of her cane, slowly, but without faltering. Unpack. The conversation between Eleanor and Richard occurred that same morning in the main living room, and Valerie didn't witness it directly, but the entire house felt it. The sounds reached her muffled by the walls, and even so, Valerie, who was in the kitchen helping prepare Eleanor's breakfast at Mrs. Holloway's direct instruction, could distinguish the tones, though not the words. Richard, elevated, controlled in form but not in substance. Eleanor, low, steady, not yielding an inch. It lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, Mark appeared at the kitchen door with an expression that was half surprise and half something Valerie couldn't quite name. "Mrs. Vance says your room is still yours," he said. Valerie felt a surge. "Thank you." Mark lingered a second longer than necessary, as if wanting to add something. Then he left. The victory, however, was not free. That same midday, Richard summoned Mrs. Holloway to his study and gave her new instructions. Instructions that Mrs. Holloway relayed to Valerie that afternoon with an expression that mixed discomfort with the divided loyalty of someone serving two masters suddenly heading in different directions. "Mr. Vance says you no longer work inside the house." Valerie frowned. "How?" "Starting tomorrow, your duties are external. Garden, garage, storage, no access to the main rooms, no serving in the dining room, no presence at any social events." Valerie processed that in silence. "And Mrs. Vance knows this?" Mrs. Holloway lowered her voice slightly. "Mr. Vance presented it as a staff reorganization, not a punishment. I understand. Are you okay?" Valerie looked out the kitchen window towards the back garden with its magenta bougainvillea and stone fountain and the dogwood tree that was starting to lose its last blooms of the season. "Yes," she said, "I'm fine." It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely a lie either. The garden, at least, had sky. What no one in that house knew, not Richard, who wanted her invisible, nor Mrs. Holloway, who wanted her quiet, nor even Eleanor, who wanted her protected, was that Valerie Davis carried something that the 4 months in that manor had silently nurtured. It wasn't rage, though rage existed. It wasn't pride, though pride was also there. It was something more patient and more dangerous, the memory of details. Valerie had the kind of mind that effortlessly records what most people dismiss. Conversations in hallways, papers left on desks when no one expects staff to be able to read, names mentioned in low voices on phone calls, dates, numbers, contradictions between what is said publicly and what is done privately. 4 months of invisibility had been, without anyone planning it, 4 months of archiving. And that archive, that night, as Valerie organized garden tools in the dark storage room and listened to the house settle into its night routine, began to reveal its true weight. There were things that didn't add up in Richard's management of family assets. Small things at first. A name on an invoice that didn't correspond, a transfer mentioned in a call that didn't appear in visible records, but which together formed a pattern. And patterns, Valerie knew, ever since she learned to read the world instead of just inhabiting it, don't lie. She didn't yet have enough to know exactly what Richard was doing, but she knew he was doing something, and she also knew that sooner or later, it was going to matter. It was that same week, on Thursday afternoon, when Eleanor called her inside the house for the first time since the reorganization. Not through Mrs. Holloway, not through Mark, but directly, with that soft, precise voice Valerie would recognize anywhere. "Valerie, please come in." Eleanor's room was the largest in the manor. Floor-to-ceiling windows, cream silk curtains, an antique vanity with an oval mirror that returned the afternoon light in golden tones. Eleanor was sitting in the armchair by the window, her hands crossed in her lap, maintaining that straight posture even when no one was watching. "Close the door." Valerie obeyed. "Sit down, please." "Ma'am, I just sit, Valerie." She sat on the edge of the armchair opposite Eleanor, hands on her knees. Eleanor looked at her for a moment, not with the evaluative gaze employers use to measure staff, but with something different, more direct, more horizontal, like someone looking at another whom they need to know if they can fully trust. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer me truthfully, even if the truth is uncomfortable." "Yes, ma'am. What have you noticed in this house?" Valerie didn't respond immediately. She weighed the question's gravity, its layers, what it implied that Eleanor was asking it. "To what exactly are you referring?" she asked carefully. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "To what's happening with my money," she said, "and with my papers, and with the decisions being made without telling me." The silence that followed had a different quality than all the previous silences that week. It was a threshold silence, the kind that exists just before something crosses from one side to another and can no longer return. Valerie breathed and began to speak. Speaking was harder than Valerie expected, not because she lacked words, she had them, organized with that meticulous precision she had cultivated during months of silent observation, but because saying them aloud was to make them real. While they remained hidden inside her, they were only suspicions, intuitions, patterns her mind might have constructed from unrelated coincidences. But the moment she uttered them in front of Eleanor, with the door closed and the afternoon light falling golden through the silk curtains, they ceased to be intuitions and became accusations. And an accusation against the son of the woman sitting in front of you carries a very specific weight, one that doesn't disappear even if the woman nods and asks you to continue. Valerie spoke for 20 minutes. She told her about the invoice from the industrial equipment supplier she had once seen on Richard's open desk when she entered to clean, not knowing he was out. The company name did not match any suppliers the staff knew, and the amount was considerable. She told her about the call she overheard by chance from the hallway one Tuesday afternoon, Richard pacing back and forth in his study, his voice lower than usual, where he mentioned a name, Barrington, and a date, and something about pending signatures that needed to be resolved before the situation became more complicated. She told her about the lawyers who visited the house with a frequency that had increased in the last 2 months, always meeting only with Richard, always carrying folders that left closed and returned open. She also told her about the envelope. That particular detail was the one that had troubled her the most, because it was the hardest to explain with an innocent justification. 3 weeks prior, while Valerie was arranging books in the library, a task assigned to her precisely because it was considered irrelevant, far from the spaces where important things happened, she found between 2 volumes of economic history a manila envelope sealed with Eleanor's name handwritten on the front. Not the full name, just Eleanor, in Richard's handwriting, which Valerie knew from internal memos sometimes left on tables. She didn't open it, but she noticed it. And she also noticed that when she returned 3 days later to finish the library work, the envelope was gone. Eleanor listened to everything without interrupting, with that stillness characteristic of people accustomed to receiving difficult information without letting their face betray their inner thoughts. Only at the end, when Valerie finished and silence settled between the two, did Eleanor close her eyes for a brief moment. "How long have you been carrying all this?" she asked. "Since the 2nd month, more or less. And you didn't say anything?" "It wasn't my place, ma'am." Eleanor opened her eyes, and in them was something Valerie took a second to identify. It wasn't surprise, it was confirmation. The kind of confirmation that hurts precisely because it means the doubt already existed before, and now it simply has a witness. "Thank you for telling me," Eleanor said. "Now I need you to do something for me. Anything. For now, don't say anything to anyone. Not to Mrs. Holloway, not to Mark, not to any of the staff. Can you do that?" "Yes, good." She stood up slowly with her cane. "And Valerie, be careful." What Valerie didn't know, not until later, when the pieces began to fit with that specific brutality that truth has when it suddenly assembles, was that that conversation with Eleanor had had a witness, not in the room, in the hallway. Mark had passed by the closed door at the wrong moment, or perhaps at the too right moment, depending on how you looked at it. He hadn't heard the content. The walls of that manor were thick, and Eleanor spoke in a low voice, but he had seen the closed door, the elapsed time, and had drawn his own conclusions. and those conclusions reached Richard's study that night. Friday dawned cloudy, with that slate-colored sky that in New York City announces rain for midday and delivers without fail. Valerie went out to the garden early, as her new duties required, and began pruning the rose bushes on the right side with a concentration that was half real work and half shield. While her hands did something concrete, her mind could process in peace. It was Al who appeared through the side gate at 9 a.m. with his guard uniform slightly askew and a thermos of coffee that was clearly for both of them. Albert Fuentes, Al to everyone at the manor, had spent 11 years guarding the main entrance of the Vance property. He was 52, with a generous belly he described as an emergency energy reserve, the most honest mustache in the Western world, and a philosophy of life summarized in 3 principles: mind his own business, drink coffee hot enough, and be loyal to whoever deserved it. Valerie, in his opinion, deserved it. He had decided that from the first week, when she was the only staff member who asked his full name instead of just calling him the guard. "Brought reinforcements," he announced, lifting the thermos. "You're an angel, Al, so they tell me." He sat on the curb of the stone path with the ease of someone who has been part of the landscape for years. "How are you? After everything on Wednesday?" "Fine, liar." Valerie smiled despite everything. "Fine, considering. That's more honest." He extended the thermos cup to her. "Listen, Valerie, I have to tell you something, and I don't know if you'll like it." She looked at him. "Mark was asking questions about you yesterday, about what you were doing in the afternoon, who you had spoken with." He paused. "You know who Mark works for when he's not being the gate attendant." Valerie nodded slowly. "I know, and I didn't do anything wrong." "It's not about doing anything wrong, girl. It's about there being people in this house who, if they see you breathe in the wrong direction, already have a problem with you." Al wrapped his hands around the thermos and looked at her with that seriousness that appeared in him when he stopped being the comic character and became simply a man who had seen many things. "Be careful." "Yes, Eleanor told me the same last night." "Well, listen to Mrs. Vance, because in this house, she's the only one with her head screwed on right." The rain arrived exactly at midday, as the morning sky had promised, and Valerie had to take refuge in the large storage shed by the side of the garden, while she waited for it to subside. It was an organized and dry space, with metal shelves where gardening tools, irrigation system spare parts, and several boxes of materials no one had opened in months were kept. It was there, as she waited, sitting on a wooden bench with the rain drumming on the corrugated roof, that her mind began to organize what she knew. It was a habit she'd had since childhood, when she lived in the small apartment in Queens with her mom and grandma, and problems, which were many and frequent, needed to be ordered so as not to become a chaos that would crush everything. Her grandma Rose had taught her, "Problems are like dirty laundry, my dear. If you leave them lying around, they pile up into a mountain, and you can't even get into the room. You have to fold them and stack them and know what you have." Valerie folded and stacked what she had, concrete suspicions about irregular financial movements, an invoice seen but not photographed, a call overheard but not recorded, a disappeared envelope, consistent behavioral patterns over 4 months, and, since last night, Eleanor's implicit confirmation that she also had doubts. What she didn't have were proofs, nothing tangible, nothing verifiable, nothing that could stand up against the lawyers Richard already had on his side. What she needed: access and time. 2 things Richard had just considerably reduced by moving her to the garden. What she had in her favor: Richard considered her a solved problem. Men who believe they have solved a problem, Valerie had learned, stop paying attention. And when they stop paying attention, the problem, if patient, can move. That night, as the rain continued and the garden smelled of earth and petrichor mixed with drenched jasmine, Valerie took out the small notebook she kept in the inner pocket of her jacket, a spiral-bound notebook, the kind bought in any stationery store, with a worn blue cover, and began to write. She wasn't keeping a diary. She had never found it useful to record feelings. Feelings already lived in the body without needing an archive. What she wrote was something else: dates, names, details. The invoice: approximate date, company name, estimated amount. The call: day, time, the exact words she remembered. The envelope: description, date seen, date disappeared. It was little, but it was something, and something well kept and well used could grow. The following Monday, everything changed again. Valerie was in the back garden, fixing the irrigation system by the bougainvillea wall, when she heard voices on the terrace overlooking the garden. Richard and one of his lawyers, the younger one, the one who always arrived with a black briefcase and a navy blue tie. They weren't shouting. They were talking in the tone of two people discussing something urgent they didn't want anyone else to hear, which meant they spoke only slightly softer than normal. Just enough to believe no one could hear them, but not enough for it to be true. Valerie continued working on the irrigation, her hands busy, her eyes on the pipes, her ears on the terrace. You can't keep waiting, Richard. If your mother doesn't sign by the 30th, the window closes, and we lose everything we've structured. I know. And what does she say? A pause. She's being difficult. Difficult or impossible? Difficult. There's still time. 2 weeks isn't time. It's a countdown. The lawyer lowered his voice further, and Valerie had to concentrate. Is she still set on consulting with Ethan? Ethan isn't here right now, but if she calls him, she won't call him. Richard's voice had that specific certainty of someone who has taken measures to prevent something from happening. I'll take care of that. How? I already took care of it. The lawyer didn't respond immediately. Then, Richard, I need you to tell me exactly what you did, because if there's anything that I said, I already took care of it. Long pause. All right, but the 30th is the 30th. I know. Footsteps on the terrace, the glass door opening and closing. Valerie continued with the irrigation. Her hands didn't tremble, but in her head, a missing piece had just found its place. There was someone else, an older brother, Ethan, who was out of the country, and whom Richard, in some way that was not yet clear, he had managed to keep out of his mother's reach. She pulled out the blue notebook. That night she wrote the name Ethan Vance and below it the question she would need to answer. Where is he? And why doesn't he know what's happening here? It was Grandma Rose who came to her mind that night, when everything was dark and the rain had finally stopped, and the garden smelled of clean earth. Her grandmother had died when Valerie was 16, but her voice remained one of the most present within her, a small, firm voice of a woman who had raised 3 children alone after being widowed at 34, who had washed others' clothes for 20 years without losing her dignity, who knew exactly how much the world weighed and had told her granddaughter without embellishment or cruelty, only with the specific clarity of love, love that doesn't lie. The world isn't fair, Valerie. You know that already, but it has cracks. And through the cracks, light enters, even if only a little. You learn to see the cracks. Valerie looked at the blue notebook. The cracks were there. She just had to know where to start. Eleanor worsened on Tuesday. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. She wasn't the kind of woman who allowed herself such things, but something quieter, and therefore, more unsettling. Valerie arrived in the back garden at 7 a.m. and saw that the curtains in Eleanor's room, which were normally already open at that hour because Eleanor was an early riser by conviction, were still closed. At 9, Mrs. Holloway came out to inform the staff that Mrs. Vance would not be coming down for breakfast. At 10:30, the doctor arrived. Dr. Hayes, a thin, serious man with tortoiseshell glasses, who visited the manor monthly for routine checkups, but this time no one had called him in advance. He arrived at Richard's direct instruction, which in itself was a piece of information Valerie registered and filed away. Al confirmed it at lunchtime in his usual tone, but with something quieter underneath. The doctor was there for an hour and a half. He left with a poker face, which is the face they make when things aren't good, but they've been paid not to tell anyone. Do you know what's wrong with her? Nothing she didn't have before, according to Richard. Al took a sip of coffee. But you know how it is. Nothing new can be many things, depending on how old what was already there is. Valerie ate the rest of her lunch in silence. That afternoon, as she pruned the side hedge with green-handled shears that needed sharpening but were all she had, she made a decision. It was a decision she knew could cost her dearly if it went wrong, but the cost of not making it was beginning to feel heavier than the cost of making it. She needed to talk to Eleanor again. The opportunity came in a way Valerie hadn't calculated, but which in retrospect seemed inevitable. That same afternoon, at 6 o'clock, Mrs. Holloway asked her to take a tray with chamomile tea and shortbread cookies to Eleanor's room because the rest of the staff had other duties, and she was already on her way to the garden anyway. Valerie carried the tray up. She knocked 3 times softly. Come in. Eleanor's room was dim. The curtains were still partially closed, letting in only a strip of afternoon light that fell on the Persian rug. Eleanor was sitting up in bed, propped against several pillows, wearing an ivory robe, her hair unbound. It was the first time Valerie had seen her like this, relaxed and less armored. And although her posture was still straight, there was something different about her, a kind of weight that wasn't there before. Valerie, there was no surprise in her voice, only recognition. I brought you tea, ma'am. Put the tray on the nightstand. She did. And then, because Eleanor said nothing more, and because the silence had a quality of invitation, Valerie remained standing by the bed. "Sit," Eleanor said finally, gesturing to the chair. Valerie sat down. For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, in the garden, the wind could be heard moving through the bougainvillea, that soft, constant sound that had begun to seem to Valerie like the manor's own voice. "Richard wants to institutionalize me," Eleanor said. The words fell into the room with terrible precision, without preambles, without setup, just the fact, stated in the same tone one might announce the weather forecast. Valerie did not speak. "He says it's for my own good, that I need specialized care that can't be provided at home." A pause. "That I'm losing my memory." "And are you losing your memory?" Valerie asked carefully. Eleanor looked at her with something that in other circumstances might have been humor. "Valerie, when was the last time you saw me forget someone's name, lose my train of thought in a conversation, or confuse a date? Never. Correct?" The silence returned, but different, now with more specific gravity. "Are there papers? A medical diagnosis?" Valerie asked. Dr. Hayes signed a report. Eleanor's voice didn't change tone, but her hands on the covers clenched slightly. "A report I didn't see until this morning when Richard showed it to me, and which doesn't correspond to anything the doctor and I have discussed in 2 years of consultations." "Dr. Hayes has been my doctor for 12 years. Pause. "But he's been the doctor Richard recommended when the previous one retired. For 3 years. Valerie processed that in silence for a moment. "What exactly does the report say?" "Moderate cognitive impairment, with episodes of temporal disorientation." She recited it from memory with the precision of someone who has reread something several times looking for errors, which is enough, according to Richard's lawyers, to initiate a legal guardianship process. "Guardianship, if I am declared legally incapable of managing my own assets." Eleanor didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Valerie understood completely. It wasn't just about institutionalizing Eleanor. It was about stripping her of the legal capacity to make decisions about her money, about her inheritance, about the documents that still needed her signature and which, according to the conversation Valerie had overheard from the garden, had to be signed before the 30th. "How much time do you have?" she asked. "For the formal legal process, months. But Richard doesn't need the formal process if he gets me to voluntarily sign the transfer of powers." Eleanor slowly picked up her teacup. "And if I don't sign voluntarily, he needs the process. And for the process, he needs more medical evaluations, and he already has the doctor on his side." The garden outside continued to stir in the wind. Valerie thought of the name she had written in her blue notebook 3 days earlier. "Ma'am," she said, "when was the last time you spoke with Ethan?" Eleanor set the cup down on the nightstand with a stillness that was itself an answer. 2 months ago, she said. "He called me from Oslo. He said he was having problems with his internet connection and would find it difficult to communicate for a while." A pause. "Since then, his calls go straight to voicemail. His emails get no response. And when I asked Richard to get me an alternative number to contact him, he told me Ethan was on a very demanding project and would appear when he could." "And you believed him?" The answer was slow in coming. "I believed him for 6 weeks, Eleanor said. "Then I stopped believing him." "Why 6 weeks?" "Because in 6 weeks, Ethan has never failed to call me for more than 10 days straight in all the years he's been away. Since he was 22 and went to study in Madrid, he has always called. Always." Her voice didn't break, but something in it tensed, like a string pulled near its limit. "Ethan didn't forget me. Ethan doesn't know what's happening here, and that can only mean one thing. Someone prevented him from knowing." Yes, Valerie spent that night in the storage shed, not because she had been sent there, her room was still hers, as Eleanor had decreed, but because she needed to think in a space where no one would look for her. The shed had an old wooden chair by the small window, and from there she could see the garden illuminated by the security lights, a green and silent rectangle that at night looked like it was from another dimension. She opened the blue notebook, wrote down everything Eleanor had told her, with the same precision she had recorded everything before. The medical report, Dr. Hayes' name, the guardianship, the 30th deadline, the communication block with Ethan. Then she drew a horizontal line in the center of the page and wrote on one side what Richard has, and on the other what we have. On Richard's side, assigning doctor, lawyers, administrative control of the house, time running in his favor, and the conviction that Eleanor was alone. On their side, Valerie's memory, the notebook, Eleanor's intact lucidity, and the possibility still only a possibility of finding Ethan. It wasn't a balanced scale, but it wasn't a defeat either. The cracks, her Grandma Rose's voice told her from somewhere within, learn to see the cracks. On Wednesday, Valerie made what from the outside might seem like a mistake, and from the inside was a calculated decision. She entered Richard's study, not at night, not stealthily. She entered at 11 a.m. with a bucket and a cloth, as if it were part of her cleaning routine. She knew Richard had an external meeting until 2 p.m. Al had mentioned it, without knowing it mattered, and that Mark would be in the garage checking the car. The time window was small, but sufficient. The study smelled of old wood and paper, that specific smell of places where decisions are made and records are kept. Valerie cleaned the surfaces with slow movements and quick eyes. The desk was tidy. Richard was meticulous, another useful fact. But on the side drawer was a brown folder with the letterhead of a law firm Valerie recognized. Barrington and Associates, the same name from the call she had overheard weeks ago. She didn't open the folder, but she read what she could see on the top sheet that protruded slightly from the edge. It was columns of numbers, and in the header, in small but legible print, the name of a real estate company, Texarkana Real Estate LLC, and below in parentheses, constituted in the name of E.V. V. pending notarial ratification. E.V.V. Eleanor Vance, widow of the initials of Eleanor, a real estate company constituted in Eleanor's name without Eleanor's knowledge. Valerie left the study with the bucket, the cloth, and that information locked away in a place in her mind where important things don't move. She told Eleanor that afternoon. Eleanor received the information in the same tone she had received everything else, without collapsing, without raising her voice. With that calm Valerie now recognized as Eleanor's specific way of processing things that deeply hurt her. Texarkana Real Estate, she repeated. That's what I read. Edward had some land in Texarkana. She paused, part of the inheritance that hasn't yet been formally distributed, the most valuable parcels. And if Richard constituted a company in your name to transfer it without you noticing, he would need my signature, or a signature that looks like yours. The silence that followed was the heaviest of all they had shared. Eleanor rose slowly from the chair, went to the vanity, and opened the bottom drawer. She took out a thick, cream-colored envelope with her name written on the front in black ink. She held it for a moment before handing it to Valerie. Open it. Inside were 3 pages. Valerie read them carefully. They were property transfer documents, specifically for the Texarkana land, in the name of the company she had just read about in the study. And at the bottom of the last page, in the space for Eleanor Vance's signature, there was a signature that was not Eleanor's. It looked very similar, but it was not the same. When did this arrive? Valerie asked. Yesterday, among my normal correspondence, as if it were just any letter. Eleanor took the envelope back with a firmness that was both old age and strength. I think it was for me to sign without asking, believing it was something already resolved, or for you to see that they already had a signature ready and that the process didn't depend on your will. Eleanor looked at her. How old are you, Valerie? 26. She repeated it softly, as if the number told her something. You seem older. I had a good teacher. Eleanor held her gaze for a second, and then something in her expression changed. It didn't soften exactly, but it opened a little, like a door slightly ajar, revealing something worthwhile on the other side. I need you to help me find Ethan, she said. I was already thinking about it. Do you have a way? Valerie thought of Al, of his 11 years at the gate, of the number of people who passed through that gate and sometimes left cards, numbers, details. She thought of the blue notebook. She thought of the cracks. I'll find one, she said, and Eleanor, for the first time in that difficult and grey week, let out something that resembled hope. She didn't exactly smile, but almost. Finding Ethan Vance turned out to be easier than Valerie expected, and at the same time more complicated than she would have liked. The easy part. Al, 11 years at the gate of a high-profile manor, yields a surprising number of contacts. Not elegant contacts, not lawyers, nor business owners, nor people from the Vance's social calendar, but real contacts. Chauffeurs, messengers, maintenance technicians, personal assistants from neighboring families, staff from travel agencies who delivered confirmations in sealed envelopes, invisible people like Valerie, who saw and remembered things the owners would never know had been observed. It was precisely one of those contacts, George, the Arriagas' chauffeur, who lived 3 properties down the same street, who gave Al the information they needed. Ethan Vance had returned to the States. Not that week, not the month before, but exactly 12 days ago. 12 days, Valerie repeated when Al told her on Thursday morning, thermos of coffee in hand, and an expression of someone who had just solved a riddle without fully understanding the question. 12 days. George knows because he saw him at JFK Airport, purely by chance, when he went to pick up the Arriagas from a trip. Says Ethan arrived alone with a medium suitcase and looked tired, but fine. Does he know where he is? No, but says someone at the airport heard him talking on the phone. American accent, so he's been back for a while or came earlier. And he mentioned a hotel, the Plaza Hotel, downtown. Valerie filed away the detail. And the complicated part? Al asked, reading her with the ease of someone who knew her well enough. The complicated part, Valerie said, is that if Ethan has been in the States for 12 days and hasn't come to see his mother, it's because something or someone prevented him, or because he has his own reasons we don't know. And either option changes how we need to talk to him. Al nodded slowly. And you're going to be the one to talk? Valerie thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Yes, the complicated part, it turned out, was also what Valerie hadn't calculated. That finding Ethan Vance in person required leaving the manor at a time that didn't correspond to any of her current duties, without Richard or Mark noticing, and getting to a downtown hotel that was 40 minutes by subway and another 10 on foot. Saturday was the day with the least supervision. Richard had social engagements in the afternoons. He was as consistent as a clock in that habit. Mark always accompanied him, and the rest of the staff had the afternoon off between 1 and 5 p.m. Valerie asked Mrs. Holloway for permission to go out for some personal errands. Bank errands, and I need some things from the pharmacy. Mrs. Holloway looked at her with that expression of someone who knows perfectly well there's more behind what's being said, but who has learned through decades of service that sometimes the best decision is not to ask. Back by 5. By 5. The Plaza Hotel was exactly the kind of place Valerie had seen from the outside for years, and never from the inside. A sober grey stone facade, uniformed doormen, pots with perfectly trimmed trees flanking the entrance. The kind of hotel that doesn't need to advertise itself, because its clientele already knows it exists. Valerie entered with the firm step of someone who had the right to be there, which is half the battle in any space that money reserves for its own. At the reception, she told the girl behind the counter that she had come to leave a message for Mr. Ethan Vance, that he was a relative of her employer, and that Mrs. Eleanor Vance was sending an urgent message. Using Eleanor's name was a decision she made on the subway, analyzing options. It was a risk. If Ethan had cut off communication voluntarily, if there were reasons Valerie didn't know, that name could shut everything down. But if the problem was external, if someone had blocked his contact with his mother, then that name was exactly the right key. The receptionist asked her to wait. Valerie waited standing, not sitting, looking at the lobby with its high ceilings and warm lighting, and its wine-colored leather armchairs that must have cost more than 3 months of her salary. She didn't feel out of place. She had learned not to feel out of place anywhere, because that feeling only served whoever wanted to keep her out. But she was aware of every detail. 8 minutes passed, then she heard footsteps, and when she looked up, Ethan Vance was crossing the lobby towards her. The first time Valerie saw him in person, instead of imagining him from the scattered data she had collected, what surprised her most was not his height, which was considerable, nor his resemblance to Eleanor in his eyes and gait, but the expression with which he arrived. It wasn't the cautious expression of someone expecting deceit, nor the distant expression of someone arriving out of obligation. It was the expression of someone who was truly alert, who had been expecting something without knowing exactly what form it would take. He was 35. He wore simple clothes, dark jeans, a navy blue shirt without a tie, leather shoes without excessive shine, with that specific carelessness of people who could dress better but prefer not to. Dark brown hair, slightly grown out, a tension in his jaw that Valerie recognized. It was the same tension she had seen in Eleanor all that week. Children resemble their mothers in ways they themselves don't know. "You're from my mother's side," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, my name is Valerie Davis. I work at the manor." Something crossed his expression. "Since when?" 4 months. "And my mother sent you?" "My mother doesn't know I'm here." Brief pause. "But she knows everything I'm going to tell you." Ethan studied her for a moment, not with hostile distrust, but with the reasonable distrust of someone who has learned to verify before trusting, which, in Valerie's opinion, was exactly the right attitude. "Would you like something to drink?" he said finally. "There's a lounge in the back that has more privacy." "Thank you." They spoke for an hour and a quarter. Valerie told him everything in order. The gala night. Richard's hand stopped in midair. The dismissal order, and Eleanor's intervention. The transfer to the garden. Her conversation with Eleanor. The documents. Dr. Hayes's medical report. Texarkana real estate. The signature that wasn't Eleanor's signature. Ethan listened without interrupting. Valerie had expected constant questions. That's what people did when they heard something difficult interrupt to confirm they were understanding correctly. But Ethan didn't ask until she finished. Then he picked up the glass of water in front of him, drank slowly, and for a moment stared at a fixed point on the wall with that expression of someone internally organizing a large amount of information. "The hotel," he said finally. "Sorry, how did you find me? How did you know I was here?" "A contact of the manor's gate attendant saw you arrive at the airport 12 days ago." Something in his expression changed. 12 days. "Yes. Do you know how long I've been trying to communicate with my mother?" His voice didn't rise in tone, but the content of the question had a specific density. 3 weeks since I arrived in the States. Calls going to voicemail, messages getting no response. I tried to go to the house twice. The first time, Mark told me my mother was resting and couldn't receive visitors by medical recommendation. The second, the gate was closed with instructions not to open for anyone not on the authorized list. Valerie thought of Al. "Did you speak to the gate guard?" "A different one, not the usual one." Pause. "Is Al still there?" "Yes, Al is still there." A fraction of something that could have been relief crossed his expression. "My mother doesn't know I'm in the States," he said. Not as a question, but as confirmation of something he already knew, but hearing it from someone else made it more real. "She doesn't know." Richard made sure of that. Yes, the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had just confirmed they were looking at the same problem from the same angle, which is the beginning of almost anything worthwhile. "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan asked. Not with suspicion, but with genuine curiosity. "You work in that house. You have a contract. If Richard finds out you came here, he already tried to fire me once," Valerie said. "It didn't work." Ethan looked at her. "Why are you risking this for my mother?" It was an honest question that deserved an honest answer. "Because the night your brother raised his hand against her, I was near, and it seemed to me I had to do something." She paused briefly. "And since that night, everything I've discovered has convinced me more that someone has to do something. Your mother is a lucid, fair woman, and completely alone in that house. And what they are doing to her is theft. And theft, Mr. Vance, seems wrong to me, regardless of who steals from whom." Ethan looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded with the slowness of someone who truly agrees, not out of politeness. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to get into that house," Valerie said. "And I need you to do it before the 30th. Why the 30th? Because Richard has a deadline to complete the transfer of the land, and if he doesn't complete it before then, something in the legal structure he built collapses. I don't know exactly what, but I know he's in a hurry, and people in a hurry make mistakes." Ethan processed that. "And if Richard blocks my access again, Al will be at the gate on Sunday morning." Valerie took a paper folded into quarters from her jacket pocket. "That's his personal number. Call him before 8. He'll let you in." Ethan took the paper, looked at it. "And you?" "I'll be in the garden, as always." A very brief pause. "But if something goes wrong, Mr. Vance, keep the paper and don't say where you got it." Ethan folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. "Why do you trust me?" he asked. "You don't know me." "I know your mother," Valerie said, "and children resemble their mothers in ways they themselves don't know." The subway ride back was long and silent, with the noise of the train in the background and the entire city moving around Valerie in that simultaneous and indifferent way that New York City always has. Millions of people living their own stories in the same space, knowing nothing about each other. Valerie arrived at the manor at 4:45 p.m., 15 minutes before her deadline. "Mrs. Holloway looked at her from the kitchen without saying anything. Valerie hung her jacket on the hook in the shed, took out the blue notebook, and wrote a single line. "Sunday. Ethan enters." Then she closed the notebook and waited. Sunday dawned with that October sun that in New York City doesn't fully warm, but convinces you that it does. A polite and slightly deceptive sun that made the Vance Manor garden look like something out of a postcard. Valerie was in the garden since 6:30 a.m. Pruning the north side rose bushes wasn't an urgent task. She had pruned them only 4 days prior, but it was the perfect excuse to be exactly where she needed to be. With a direct view of the main gate, was a reasonable distance from the shed where she could disappear if needed, and busy enough so no one would question her. Al arrived at 7 sharp, as he did every Sunday. He greeted Valerie with a chin gesture that was worth an entire conversation and took his place in the gatehouse with his thermos of coffee and his demeanor of a man who has been in one place so long he is now part of the architecture. At 8:15 a.m., the gate opened. Ethan Vance walked in without a car, wearing the same dark pants from 2 days prior and a gray jacket. Al greeted him with the specific warmth of someone who hasn't seen a loved one in too long. And for a moment, the two men shook hands with that grip that, between certain men, is equivalent to a hug. Valerie continued pruning. Ethan crossed the garden towards the main entrance, without stopping, without looking to the sides, with the determined step of someone who knows the way by heart. As he passed the North Roses, no more than 10 feet from Valerie, he paused just a fraction of a second. He said nothing, neither did she. But in that 3-second silence, a complete agreement was contained. What happened inside the manor during the next 2 hours, Valerie reconstructed later, in pieces, from what Al saw from the gate, what Mrs. Holloway unintentionally told her that afternoon as she vented in the kitchen, and what Eleanor herself described to her that night in a low voice from her armchair by the window. Ethan went directly to his mother's room. Eleanor, when she opened the door and saw him, said nothing for almost 10 seconds. Then she embraced him with that silent strength of mothers who have waited too long and who, when they finally have their son near, don't know whether to cry or scold him or simply not let him go. Ethan hugged her back, and according to Mrs. Holloway, who passed through the hallway at that moment and had the discretion not to stop, but not to fully close her ears, neither of them spoke for a long while. Richard learned of his brother's presence approximately 40 minutes later, when he came down for breakfast and found Mark waiting for him with that expression of someone who has news he didn't want to deliver. What followed, Valerie didn't hear directly, but the house's energy changed in a way that was perceptible even from the garden. That kind of tension that seeps through walls and changes the air temperature, making staff walk faster and silently, and avoid the main corridors without anyone having explicitly asked them to. Richard went up to his mother's room. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, Richard came down alone. Valerie knew something had gone wrong when she saw Mark exit through the side garden door at 11 a.m. with the phone to his ear, and that walk of someone receiving urgent instructions while moving. She followed him with her eyes without moving her head, another art learned from years of being part of the landscape, and saw him round the garage and disappear down the side path that led to the service exit. An hour later, everything collapsed. Valerie was putting away tools in the shed when Mrs. Holloway opened the door with an expression she had never seen on her. It wasn't the usual discomfort of a bad news messenger. It was something closer to the shame of someone being forced to do something they didn't want to do. "Valerie, what happened? I need you to come with me." "Where?" "Mrs. Holloway didn't respond immediately." She looked at the floor for a moment. "Mr. Richard wants to see you in the main living room. There are some people who want to talk to you." Valerie put the pruning shears on the shelf with a completely controlled movement. "What kind of people?" "Police." There were two, one uniformed, the other in plain clothes with a badge from the NYPD. They were standing in the main living room by the fireplace. Valerie had cleaned exactly 18 times in 4 months. And Richard was sitting in the main armchair with an expression of concern so perfectly constructed, it was almost a work of art. "Valerie Davis," said the plainclothes officer, not as a question. "Yes. We'll accompany you to the precinct. There's a complaint." Valerie didn't ask what kind of complaint. She already knew, or knew its general outlines, which was enough to keep her voice steady and her body still. "May I ask what I'm accused of?" "Theft from the premises." Richard wasn't looking at her directly. His eyes were fixed on some neutral point in the room, with that expression of a man deeply pained by what was happening, but who had no other choice, which was exactly the expression used by someone who has carefully planned what is happening and knows perfectly well they have all the options in the world. "What am I alleged to have stolen?" "A sum of cash from Mr. Vance's study," said the plainclothes officer, "and confidential documents." There it was, the documents. Richard had found a way to link her entry into the study with something concrete, something that could stand up to a formal complaint. It didn't matter if it was true. The complaint existed, and that was enough to remove her from the house and keep her away from Eleanor at the most critical moment. The moment Ethan had just arrived, the moment there were still days left until the 30th. "I understand," Valerie said, and she went with the police without resisting, without raising her voice, without looking at Richard, because she had already learned that visible anger only serves the one who has the power to ignore it. The precinct smelled of bad coffee and damp paper, and the waiting room had orange plastic chairs that had clearly been bought in another century. Valerie sat in one of them, hands on her knees, and waited with that outward calm that was not an absence of fear, but something else, certainty, built over a lifetime of solving problems without resources, that panic had never solved anything that patience couldn't solve better. She had no lawyer. She had no one to call in the formal sense of the word. Her mom lived in Queens and couldn't arrive for another 8 hours. Her friends in the city were former co-workers, good people, but without resources for this kind of situation. She had the blue notebook she carried in the inner pocket of her jacket. That was all. And she had something else, which crossed her mind as the grey noise of the precinct settled around her. Ethan Vance was in that manor. Ethan knew she had gone to find him, and if Ethan was the man his mother had suggested he was, and that Valerie, in the hour and a quarter of conversation on Saturday, had begun to believe he wasn't going to let this end here. An hour passed, then another. The bureaucracy of a domestic theft complaint in a city precinct has its own rhythms, none of them urgent. Valerie confirmed things put in front of her. She answered questions with the precise accuracy of someone who doesn't lie, but also doesn't offer more than what is asked. She listened to the formal charges carefully. She asked when she could speak with a public defender and received the usual answer, when one is available. It was 4 p.m. when things changed. The plainclothes officer came out of his cubicle with an expression Valerie already knew how to read, the expression of someone who has just been told something unexpected and is processing how to adjust their prepared behavior. "Davis, you have a visitor." Ethan entered the waiting room with a man Valerie didn't know. Older, about 60, dark suit, genuine leather briefcase. The kind of lawyer who doesn't need an introduction because his presence already makes one. Ethan looked at her for a second. In his expression was something Valerie took a moment to identify. It wasn't pity, it wasn't exactly guilt. It was something closer to the determination of someone who has just understood that the situation is more serious than he calculated, and that this means he has to move faster. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine. Mr. Sterling is the family lawyer." A very brief pause. "My mother's and mine." Mr. Sterling was already speaking with the plainclothes officer with that tone of someone who knows the exact language of each situation and uses it with surgical efficiency. Valerie looked at Ethan. "How did you know I was here?" "Al." A single word. "Al saw them take you and immediately alerted me." Valerie thought of Al's honest mustache, of the thermos of coffee, of 11 years in front of the gate. "And your mother is okay? She's with her?" "Mrs. Holloway." Pause. "Valerie, yes. When you get out of here, I need you to tell me everything. Everything you know, with dates, names, details." His voice was low but completely firm. "Because what I found in my mother's room this morning, the documents, the envelope, the doctor's report is enough to start, but it's not enough to finish." "I have a notebook," Valerie said. Ethan blinked. "What kind of notebook?" "The kind that has dates, names, and details." For the first time since she met him, something in Ethan Vance's expression relaxed a millimeter. It wasn't exactly a smile, but it resembled one. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since the second month." Ethan nodded very slowly with the same gesture he had used on Saturday, that nod that was not protocol but conviction. "Richard made a very big mistake," he said. "Which one?" "Believing the only threat he had to neutralize was me." "Mr. Sterling returned from the officer's desk with an expression that was the answer, before he said the words, "We're leaving. The charges are suspended while the legitimacy of the complaint is investigated." He looked at Valerie with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating witnesses. "Do you have anything that could compromise the complainant?" Valerie took the blue notebook from the inner pocket of her jacket and placed it on the orange plastic table in the precinct with a small, dry sound that, in the silence of that moment, sounded like something much larger. "Everything in here," she said. Mr. Sterling opened it, read the first page, then the second, then raised his eyes to Valerie with an expression that was half professional surprise and half something that in another man might have been admiration. "Do you have legal training?" "No." "Journalism either?" "No." "How did you learn to document like this?" Valerie thought of the small apartment in Queens, of her Grandma Rose folding others' laundry and organizing big problems into manageable portions, of 14 years of working in other people's homes, learning to read the world without the world knowing it was being read. "I learned to survive," she said. "And it turns out, for that, you have to know how to see." Mr. Sterling closed the notebook carefully, as if he already understood that what he held in his hands was worth more than its weight. "Let's go," he said. They left the precinct at 5:15 p.m., with the October sun already setting over the buildings, and the city noise enveloping everything in that familiar, indistinct way it always has. Valerie breathed the outside air, which smelled of car exhaust and pizza and hot dogs from a nearby stand, and that specific mix of dust and urgency that is New York City's own scent. And for a moment, she stood still on the sidewalk, letting her lungs process that she was on the other side. Ethan was by her side. "Where to?" he asked. Valerie thought. "To the manor," she said. "We have work to do." Ethan nodded, and the two walked towards Mr. Sterling's car, which was waiting in a double-parked spot with its hazard lights on, while the city continued to move around them, knowing nothing of what was about to happen. But Richard Vance, that night in his study with dark wood walls, not yet knowing that the blue notebook existed and was already in Mr. Sterling's hands, was going to start knowing very soon, and when he did, it would already be too late. Mr. Sterling had an office in Tribeca that smelled of old books and strong brewed coffee, and which contrasted strangely with the millimeter precision with which the man ordered the world within it. Every folder in its place, every document with its date, every file with its story kept between two brown cardboard covers, as if time could be tamed with enough organization. It was exactly the kind of space where Valerie felt comfortable, without having been able to explain why, until she thought about it in the car on the way from the precinct, and understood. It was like her blue notebook, a place where chaos became legible. The three of them arrived at 6 p.m. Mr. Sterling turned on his desk lamp, placed Valerie's notebook open on the green leather blotter, and took out his own yellow notepad with thick-lined pages, and a fine-tipped black pen he used with the economy of someone who knows that written words cost. And he said, without preamble, "Let's start at the beginning." Valerie spoke for 2 hours. It wasn't difficult in the sense of finding the words. She had the words, ordered with that precision of 4 months of systematic observation. The difficulty was another kind, that of saying aloud in a lawyer's office, in front of two men taking notes, things that for months she had kept as a personal burden, not fully knowing if they would ever serve for anything more than the private record of an injustice no one else would see. Every piece of data that left the notebook and passed onto Mr. Sterling's yellow pages became more real, heavier, more irrevocable. Texarkana real estate, Dr. Hayes and the altered medical report, the forged signature on the transfer documents, the communication block with Ethan, the 30th deadline and the urgency surrounding it, the lawyers from Barrington and Associates, the name overheard on the terrace, the irregular financial movements, the manila envelope with the signature that wasn't Eleanor's signature. Mr. Sterling wrote without interrupting. Only occasionally did he look up and ask a brief, precise question. Do you remember the exact name of the company? Was it before or after Tuesday? Did you see the signature directly or through the paper? And then he continued writing. Ethan listened. He didn't take notes. He didn't ask questions. He sat in the side armchair with his elbows on his knees and his eyes fixed on Valerie, with an expression that changed throughout those 2 hours, in a way she registered without comment. At first, it was the contained tension of someone confirming what he already suspected. Then, as the details accumulated and the pattern became clearer, it turned into something different, darker, more personal. Because it's one thing to suspect your brother is stealing from your mother, and another to hear detail by detail for 2 hours, exactly how he's doing it. It was 8 p.m. when Mr. Sterling closed his notepad, placed the pen on it with his usual care, and leaned back slightly in his chair with the expression of someone who has just finished assembling a complex puzzle and is verifying that all the pieces fit. Good, he said. That single word, in his particular tone, was equivalent to a diagnosis. How much? Ethan asked. Enough to start. The lawyer put his fingertips together. What Mr. Richard has is time and legal structure. Lawyers who have built a careful scaffolding for months, a signing doctor. Documents that, if presented first, can establish a narrative before you can counter-argue. And we have something worth more than structure when used well. He looked at the blue notebook. We have the sequence, dates, names, verifiable contradictions. The signature on the transfer document can be forensically examined. Your mother's real clinical history can be compared with Dr. Hayes' report. And Texarkana Real Estate has a notarized articles of incorporation that is in the public registry and that any judge can consult. Time? Valerie asked. To do what exactly? To have everything ready before the 30th. Mr. Sterling looked at her with that quick assessment he had already used at the precinct. If Miss Fort Davis can accompany me tomorrow morning to file a formal complaint with the notebook as documentary basis and her statement as testimony. And if you, he said, looking at Ethan, can gain access to the bank statements and records of the family business that Richard manages, we have real possibilities before the 30th. And Dr. Hayes? Dr. Hayes is the weakest link in the entire chain. A pause. Doctors who sign false reports under economic pressure generally break quickly when presented with evidence that the full context is going to come to light. They are not career criminals. They are people who made a bad decision and suddenly see the real consequences. Ethan nodded slowly. Do you have access to your mother's real medical history? Mr. Sterling asked. My mother keeps copies of everything. A small pause. Always. It was one of the things my father taught her. Never let important documents exist only in someone else's hands. Where does she keep them? In a safe deposit box in her room. A longer pause that Richard doesn't know exists. For the first time all night, Mr. Sterling offered something resembling a smile. Good, he said again. Valerie did not return to the manor that night. It was a decision the three of them made by mutual agreement, without much debate. Richard knew Valerie had left the precinct with Ethan and Mr. Sterling. And although he couldn't do anything legal to prevent her from returning to her room, Eleanor was still the lady of that house. And the room was still Valerie's by her decree. It would be imprudent to enter territory where the other side had a terrain advantage while they were still assembling their response. Mr. Sterling made a call and arranged for Valerie to stay that night at the home of a colleague of his, a retired lawyer who lived 4 blocks away and had a guest room with a single bed and a habit of not asking questions of guests who arrived on Mr. Sterling's recommendation. Ethan drove her to the door. During the 5-minute journey through dimly lit back streets with the dull roar of the city at night, there was a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but rather the kind that occurs between two people who have just shared 2 hours of difficult truths and are still processing where that left them. It was Ethan who spoke first. How long have you been alone with all this? Valerie considered the question. From the beginning, one is alone with the things one decides not to tell. Pause. 4 months. Weren't you afraid? Yes. And I was afraid anyway. It's not incompatible. Ethan looked at the street in front of him for a moment. My mother told me something this morning, he said. When I saw her, before I could tell her anything about how I found her, before explaining about the hotel or the 12 days, the first thing she said to me was, Ethan, there's a young woman in this house with more courage than half the men your father knew in life. Valerie said nothing. I don't usually believe in quick judgments, Ethan continued. But my mother doesn't either, and in 74 years, she hasn't been wrong about much. The car stopped in front of the retired lawyer's house. Valerie put her hand on the door handle. Tomorrow at 8 at Mr. Sterling's office, she said. At 8. She opened the door, then paused for a second without fully turning around. Mr. Vance. Ethan. A brief pause. Ethan, she said without difficulty, as if the name were already familiar before she used it. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. I know. Get some sleep. She said it in the tone one uses with someone one already knows won't sleep much, but the instruction is a gesture of care more than an order. Ethan received it that way. You too. Valerie slept 4 hours, which, given the circumstances, was a considerable achievement. The retired lawyer's bed was firm and smelled of lavender, and the room had a small window overlooking an inner courtyard where a fig tree gently tapped the glass in the wind. Valerie lay looking at that fig tree in the darkness for a while before exhaustion overcame her, thinking about the sequence of what was coming. The formal complaint, the forensic examination of the signature, Eleanor's real medical history, Texarkana real estate, and its articles of incorporation in the public registry, Dr. Hayes, and his weak link. And Richard, somewhere in the manor, with the careful scaffolding he had built for months, and the certainty still, for now that he controlled the situation. He didn't control it, but he didn't know it yet. And those hours of difference between what someone believes they control and the moment they discover they don't were exactly the crack Valerie needed. Monday was the longest day of her recent life, and at the same time, the most orderly. Because when there's too much to do, the brain finds an efficiency it doesn't normally have. The formal complaint was filed at 9 a.m. at the district attorney's office, with Mr. Sterling accompanying Valerie and the blue notebook as the base document. The people who received them were young and serious, with that energy of someone who still believes in the work they do, and listened to Valerie's statement with genuine attention, which she appreciated without mentioning it. Meanwhile, Ethan had entered the manor early, Al again at the gate. Richard still asleep at that hour, and he had gone to his mother's room, where Eleanor, with a lucidity that contradicted any medical report to the contrary, opened the hidden safe behind the closet panel and took out 3 years of real medical history. Consultations, analyses, diagnoses, everything in chronological order, with Dr. Hayes's handwriting in the margins. Completely contradictory to the report he had signed for Richard. Ethan photographed every page with his phone, then searched his mother's correspondence file, another habit inherited from Edward. Everything saved, everything dated, and found the bank statements for the last 3 years of the family business. Transfers that did not correspond to any registered operation, payments to Texarkana real estate that appeared in internal records as property maintenance expenses, without additional specification, and 2 checks of considerable amount signed with Eleanor's name on dates when she, according to her own calendar, another document she kept with archivist precision, was out of town. By the time Mr. Sterling returned from his morning at the district attorney's office, Ethan had everything in a digital folder sent to his email with a copy to Mr. Sterling. Mr. Sterling reviewed it in 30 minutes. "Sufficient," he said, and this time there was no reservation in the word. What none of the 3 calculated was Richard's speed, because Richard, who had spent months building that scaffolding with the patience of someone who believed he had time on his side, also had his own alert system, people in strategic places who kept him informed of relevant movements. And when one of those contacts reported that afternoon that a formal complaint had been filed at the district attorney's office with Ethan Vance as the complainant and Valerie Davis as the main witness, Richard made a decision that Mr. Sterling, when he found out the next day, described as the classic error of the man who believes that attacking is the same as winning. That night, Richard summoned his own lawyer, the one from Barrington and Associates, the one with the navy blue tie, to an urgent meeting in the study with dark walls. And while they met, in Eleanor's room, with the fig tree tapping the glass of another window in another part of the city, Ethan told his mother everything that had happened. Eleanor listened with open eyes and quiet hands on the covers. When Ethan finished, she remained silent for a moment that stretched long enough to have its own weight. "And Valerie," she asked finally, "is she all right? She's coming back tomorrow. She's safe?" "Yes, Mom." Another silence. "Ethan, your father always said that you know the worth of people, not when things are going well, but when someone puts them in a position to choose." She paused. Richard chose. Ethan did not respond, and Valerie also chose. Eleanor's voice was low, but completely firm, as always, like a beam that supports, even if it's unseen. "I want that when all this passes, it is not forgotten." "It won't be forgotten," Ethan said, and he said it with the voice of someone who doesn't make promises he doesn't intend to keep. Outside, the city night continued with its dull, constant roar, knowing nothing of the 2 brothers in that dark study, nor of the elderly woman and her son in the lit room, nor of the blue notebook that, in the Tribeca office, waited to become the piece that would bring down everything Richard had built. But the 30th was approaching, and now, for the first time, it wasn't Richard who was getting there first. On Wednesday the 28th, 2 days before the 30th, Dr. Hayes arrived at Mr. Sterling's office at 10 a.m. with an expression that Valerie, sitting in the side armchair by the window, immediately recognized. It was the expression of someone who comes to confess something they can no longer carry. He hadn't been difficult to get to come. Mr. Sterling had sent the doctor, through an intermediary, an envelope with 3 documents. The altered medical report Richard had presented, a selection of Dr. Hayes's own real clinical notes extracted from Eleanor's history, and a brief letter, without explicit threats, that simply described the current state of the investigation and mentioned, with the surgical precision that characterized Mr. Sterling, that the district attorney's medical experts would be reviewing both documents in the next 48 hours. The doctor arrived alone, without a lawyer, which was, in Mr. Sterling's opinion, the first sign that he was willing to talk. Valerie did not participate in that meeting. She waited outside in the reception room with the brown folders and the smell of old books, while Ethan and Mr. Sterling spoke with the doctor for 50 minutes that, from outside, seemed longer. When the door opened, Mr. Sterling poked his head out. "Miss Davis, would you come in?" Dr. Hayes was a man of about 55, thin, with completely white hair and hands that Valerie, when she shook his hand upon being introduced, noticed were not entirely steady. They didn't seem like the hands of an evil man. They seemed like the hands of someone who had made a bad decision and had been living with it long enough for the weight to show physically. "Dr. Hayes is going to make a supplementary statement to the district attorney's office," Mr. Sterling said with that neutral tone that was itself a verdict, describing the circumstances under which he signed the report. Valerie looked at the doctor. "Richard pressured you?" The doctor nodded once without raising his eyes from the green carpet. "He told me it was to protect Mrs. Vance, that she was making decisions that were detrimental to her, and that a formal diagnosis would allow for care measures to be established." A pause. "He told me it was temporary, that as soon as certain family matters were resolved, the report would be withdrawn. And you believed him?" The doctor looked up for the first time. "I wanted to believe him," he said, and in that distinction between times believing times and times wanting to believe, Valerie knew immediately lay all the difference between guilt and complicity. With Dr. Hayes's statement and Eleanor's real clinical history, the basis of Richard's argument for guardianship collapsed at its most vulnerable point. There was no longer a valid medical diagnosis, and without a diagnosis, there was no incapacitation process. And without an incapacitation process, Eleanor remained exactly what she had always been, a 74-year-old woman in full possession of her faculties, with the absolute legal right to make her own decisions about her own assets, which meant that the signing of the transfer documents Richard needed before the 30th depended solely on Eleanor's will, and Eleanor was not going to sign. What was still missing was the hardest part. It wasn't enough to stop Richard. It was necessary to expose him, because a man who has built a scaffolding for months with his own lawyers and strategic contacts does not simply stop because one flank fails. He looks for another angle, waits for a moment of carelessness, reorganizes. Mr. Sterling had said it with his characteristic precision, which left no room for premature optimism. Legally neutralizing him is the first step. Exposing him to the family is the second. Without the second, the first lasts only so long. The second step was scheduled for Friday the 29th, one day before the 30th. It was Ethan who proposed the family meeting, not as a confrontation. That word, he explained to the lawyer, had too much emotional baggage and too little procedural control. Instead, it was a review of the status of family assets, which was exactly the kind of phrase Richard could not refuse to hear without raising suspicions, because it was precisely the kind of meeting he himself regularly convened when it suited him. The invitation reached Richard through Mr. Sterling's lawyers on Wednesday afternoon, formal and correct, with letterhead and date and the list of those who would be present. Ethan Vance, in his capacity as co-owner of family assets, Eleanor Vance, widow of Vance, in her capacity as title holder of the assets, Mr. Sterling as legal counsel to both, and the lawyers from Barrington and Associates who were invited in the interest of transparency and constructive dialogue. Richard accepted. He had to accept. Refusing would have been a declaration in itself. Friday, the 29th, dawned with rain. Not the polite October rain that convinces without fully wetting, but a serious rain, one of those that arrive with wind and make the entire city change its mood. The bougainvillea in the manor garden shook against the wall, and the sky was the specific color of lead when it is heavy enough. Valerie arrived at the manor at 9 a.m. Al greeted her at the gate with the thermos, always the thermos, and a nod of the head that was at once welcome and warning and support, all in the same discreet movement of 11 years of gestural economy. "How is Mrs. Vance?" Valerie asked as she signed the entry log. "She slept well last night, according to Mrs. Holloway." Pause. "She's ready." And Richard arrived late last night. Spent 2 hours in the study on the phone with someone. Al lowered his voice slightly, though there was no real need, as there was no one else at the gate. "He's quiet this morning. Too quiet." Valerie knew that kind of quiet. It was the quiet of someone who believed they still had an ace up their sleeve. The meeting was scheduled for 11 a.m. in the manor's boardroom, a room Valerie had cleaned enough times to know every detail. The oval mahogany table, the 12 high-backed chairs, the display cabinet with Edward's awards, the window overlooking the side garden, but which that day felt completely different. It had the specific temperature of spaces where truths will be spoken that cannot be unsaid. Eleanor arrived first, with Ethan by her side and her cane in her right hand. She sat at the end of the table that had always been, in Edward's family meetings, the place of the presiding member. She did so without consulting anyone, without hesitation. Mr. Sterling arrived with 2 folders and his fine-tipped black pen. The Barrington lawyers arrived 3 minutes later. 2, the young man in the navy blue tie, and an older one Valerie hadn't seen before, but who, by the weight with which he entered the room, was clearly the decision-maker in that firm. Richard arrived last. He entered with that carefully constructed composure Valerie knew, the correct smile, the perfect clothes, the stride of someone who knows exactly how much space he occupies in a room and uses all of it. He greeted his mother with a kiss on the cheek that Eleanor received without moving. He nodded towards Ethan with that neutrality of someone reserving judgment for later. He looked at Mr. Sterling with the cordiality of someone who recognizes an adversary and prefers not to show it. He did not look at Valerie. Valerie stood by the wall, near the window, not as a participant in the meeting that would have been a different territory, but as she had been for 4 months, part of the landscape. Only this time, the landscape knew exactly what was happening. Mr. Sterling opened the first folder. "Thank you all for being here," he said with that tone that had the form of courtesy and the substance of something else. "We'll be direct because everyone's time is valuable." Richard crossed his arms with a practiced nonchalance. "Mrs. Eleanor Vance," Mr. Sterling continued, has requested a formal review of the status of family assets administered by Mr. Richard Vance over the past 3 years. In the context of that review, a series of irregularities have emerged that need to be addressed. The senior Barrington lawyer raised a hand. Mr. Sterling, if you'll permit me, before we proceed, I'd like to establish the legal framework under which. In a moment, Mr. Barrington. Mr. Sterling's tone didn't rise an inch. Allow me to finish the preamble. Barrington lowered his hand. Mr. Sterling placed an open folder on the table in the center, with the first sheet visible. It was the Articles of Incorporation for Texarkana Real Estate, with Eleanor's name in the owner registry and the date of incorporation. Beside it, he placed the bank statements with the transfers highlighted in yellow. Beside those, Dr. Hayes's medical report, and beside that, a new document, printed that very morning, which Valerie hadn't seen before, but which Mr. Sterling had mentioned the previous night. Dr. Hayes's sworn supplementary statement, signed and notarized, describing the circumstances under which he had produced the report. Everything on the table, everything visible, everything in order. Richard did not change his expression, but his hands, which had been on the table, disappeared beneath it. Valerie noticed. Mr. Richard Vance, said Mr. Sterling, has constituted a real estate company in his mother's name, without her knowledge or consent. He has authorized transfers of funds from the family business to that company, falsely recorded as maintenance expenses. He has presented an altered medical report with the purpose of initiating a legal guardianship process that would have allowed him to manage his mother's assets without her participation. And he has signed or caused to be signed documents with a signature that forensic handwriting experts have verified as not corresponding to the authentic signature of Mrs. Eleanor Vance. Brief pause. All of the above constitutes, under the terms of Federal Criminal Code, aggravated fraud, forgery of documents, and breach of fiduciary duty. The formal complaint was filed Monday at the District Attorney's office, and there is an active investigation order. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. It was Richard who broke it, and he did so in the only way left to him, denying. "This is completely absurd," he said, his voice still controlled, still with that particular coldness. "These are baseless accusations based on malicious interpretation of perfectly legal administrative documents, instigated by." He paused, a very calculated pause, and looked towards where Valerie stood, individuals with their own interests in destabilizing this family's administration. Eleanor spoke for the first time since the meeting began. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Richard." He looked at her. "I have here," Eleanor said with a precision that belied any cognitive impairment, with the same eloquence with which the sun discredits darkness, the bank statements for the last 3 years. "I have them, not Mr. Sterling. I took them myself from my archive this week." She paused. "I also have my own clinical notes from 12 consultations with Dr. Hayes, which do not correspond at any point to what he signed in that report." Another pause. "And I have the envelope that arrived in my correspondence with my signature on 3 transfer documents that I never signed." Richard did not respond. "I am not a woman with cognitive impairment, son. I am a 4-year-old woman who spent 50 years building something with your father and who has spent 3 years watching someone dismantle it." Her voice did not break. It was worse. It became firmer. "I will not sign anything. Not now. Not on the 30th. Not ever. As long as there is anything to sign under the conditions in which it was presented." The Barrington lawyer and his young colleague looked at each other for a second. It was a second Valerie read perfectly. It was the look of 2 people who had just calculated the cost of continuing to defend a position that no longer had ground. Richard tried one last time. "Mother, this is a misunderstanding. If you let me explain." "You've explained enough," Eleanor said. "For 3 years, what followed was not dramatic in a cinematic sense. There were no shouts, no banging on the table, none of those scenes that in telenovelas require background music and a close-up on the villain's face. It was something quieter and, therefore, more devastating." The Barrington lawyer announced, with the professional voice of someone calculating damages in real time, that his firm was withdrawing from representing Mr. Richard Vance in any matter related to the family's assets, effective immediately, and that if any of the documents they had prepared contained any irregularity known to them, they would be available to cooperate with the district attorney's investigation on the terms requested. It was the final confirmation. Richard watched them leave the room with the expression of someone who had just seen the last plank of the bridge he was crossing disappear beneath his feet. Then he looked at Ethan, then at his mother, and for the last time, before getting up and leaving the room without another word, He looked at Valerie. It was the same look as the gala night almost a month prior, the same promise of consequences, only this time it was empty of real power, and they both knew it. Valerie held his gaze without blinking, just like the first time. The difference was that this time, when he left, she didn't have to go back to pick up any tray. She stood by the window as the rain continued to fall on the bougainvillea in the garden and listened as Richard's footsteps receded down the main corridor of the manor that bore the name of his father, of his mother, of a family he had tried to dispossess from within, and she thought of her Grandma Rose, of the cracks, of the light that enters through them, even if only a little. That morning, light had flooded in, justice and dawn. Richard Vance left the manor that same Friday afternoon with a medium suitcase and the expression of someone who still hadn't fully understood that what had just happened was permanent. Valerie saw him from the garden. She didn't seek him out with her eyes. It was the sound of the gate that made her look up. And when she saw him cross the threshold with the suitcase in his hand, and without looking back, she didn't feel what she had expected to feel. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief in the clean sense of the word. It was something closer to the stillness that comes when a storm ends and the air still smells of rain. But there is no wind. A calm that holds memory of danger, but which is calm nonetheless. Al closed the gate behind him. Then he looked at Valerie with that gesture of his that was worth an entire conversation. She nodded and continued with the garden. The days that followed were of a different intensity than the previous weeks. Not the intensity of danger, which has its own rapid pulse and urgent clarity, but the slower, heavier intensity of consequences. The district attorney's investigation proceeded with the efficiency that Mr. Sterling, with his contacts and precision, managed to accelerate at the right points. Forensic handwriting experts, 90 forgery of the signature on the transfer documents. Auditors, appointed by the judge, found in Texarkana Real Estate's records a pattern of movements that Mr. Sterling described to the district attorney's office as a systematic diversion of family assets executed over 18 months. 18 months. Valerie thought about it when she heard it. Richard had started this before she arrived at that house. Before the gala, before the night, a housekeeper stopped his hand in mid-air. Everything she had observed, recorded, documented in her blue notebook, was merely the visible surface of something that had been building in the depths for much longer, which also meant that if someone hadn't been looking with enough attention at the right moment, it could have ended without anyone ever seeing it. Richard was formally summoned by the district attorney's office on Tuesday of the following week. He was not immediately arrested. The legal process has its own timings, which are slow and often frustrating for those who urgently await justice. But he was charged with aggravated fraud and forgery of documents, with restrictions that included a prohibition from leaving the country and a temporary suspension of his powers as administrator of the Vance family business assets, pending judicial resolution. Mr. Sterling explained the real scope of that resolution to Eleanor and Ethan in a brief meeting in his Tribeca office. It's not the end of the process, it's the beginning of the end. Processes of this nature take time, but the structure your son built no longer has a foundation. The assets are protected, the administration is under judicial supervision, and the narrative of cognitive impairment has been completely discredited. Richard can hire the best lawyers in the country, and he will try. But what he cannot do is put a story back on paper that has already been told with evidence. Eleanor listened to everything with quiet hands in her lap. When Mr. Sterling finished, she asked the only question that mattered to her. Is the house protected? It is protected, and the Texarkana land has been reintegrated into the family estate under judicial guardianship. Eleanor nodded once. Thank you, Mr. Sterling, and she said nothing more on the subject. Valerie knew something had changed in the manor, not because of a specific event, but because of the accumulation of small things that were suddenly different. Mrs. Holloway whistled while preparing Eleanor's breakfast, something Valerie had never heard her do. Al arrived at the gate 10 minutes before his shift, without anyone asking him to. The house staff moved with a freedom that in previous weeks had been constricted, as if everyone had been carefully walking on a surface they weren't sure would hold them. The surface held, and that was noticeable in the body of every person who lived and worked in that space. It was Eleanor who asked Valerie on the second Thursday after the meeting to come up to her room via Mrs. Holloway, not Mark, who had asked for a week off and hadn't returned, which, in Al's opinion, was the most honest response anyone could give to certain kinds of situations. Directly from the hallway, with that soft, precise voice, Valerie now knew as one of the most reliable sounds in her recent world. She went up. Eleanor's room was different. The curtains were completely open for the first time since the week Eleanor had woken up unwell, the afternoon light entering in wide, golden streaks that fell on the Persian rug and the vanity and the bed, and Eleanor stood by the window, without her cane, which was in itself a declaration, looking down at the garden with that expression of someone who is both looking at something and truly seeing it. Valerie waited by the door. "Come." She approached. She stood by her side, also looking at the garden. The bougainvillea recovered from the rain. The North roses, Valerie, had pruned too much last week, and that were putting out new shoots. The stone fountain with its constant murmur, the dogwood tree that had lost all its flowers but already had the new green of someone preparing for the next season. "I want you to know something," Eleanor said. "Tell me, what you did in this house was not just to stop a hand." She paused briefly, the kind of pause people use when they weigh their words before speaking them, not because they doubt them, but because they know they carry weight. "What you did was to see, at a time when I myself was starting to doubt what I saw. You saw more clearly than anyone, and you saved it, and you used it at the right moment." Another pause. "That is no small thing, Valerie. That is exactly the kind of thing that changes the outcome of a story." Valerie looked at the garden. Anyone would have done the same. "No." Eleanor's voice was direct, without cruelty, and without condescension. "Not anyone. You did. There's a difference, and it does you no good to erase it." Valerie did not respond. Below in the garden, the stone fountain continued its constant murmur. "I want to make you a proposal," Eleanor said. "What kind?" "Ethan is going to stay. He plans to settle here permanently. There are personal and business reasons that make it preferable to returning to Europe, and I'm not going to pretend I'm not glad." A slight warmth in her voice as she said that. "The administration of the house will need to be reorganized, and I need someone I can trust in a role that isn't that of a housekeeper." Valerie looked at her. "What kind of role?" "Coordinator of staff and house operations." Eleanor held her gaze with her usual quiet firmness. "With a formal contract, revised salary, and the possibility of studying whatever you want to study concurrently, with family support. Because a person who documents evidence with the precision you did should have an education in whatever interests them, most law, administration, whatever it may be. And there's no reason in the world for her not to have it." Valerie felt something she couldn't quite name. It was too big to be surprise, and too new to have a name yet. It felt like many things at once. Gratitude, yes, but also something closer to recognition, the specific sensation that something one has been carrying for a long time has just been seen by someone else and named aloud, and that act of naming it makes it more real and at the same time lighter. "I don't know what to say, ma'am. Say yes or say no, or say you need to think about it," which is also a valid answer. Valerie thought of her Grandma Rose, of the small apartment in Queens, of 14 years of work and 4 months of observation and a blue notebook full of dates and names and patterns no one else had seen until it became necessary for someone to see them. She thought of the cracks, of the light. "Yes," she said. Eleanor nodded with that assent of hers that was conviction rather than protocol. "Good." It wasn't until that afternoon, descending the manor's main staircase with her hands free and her heart somewhere between her chest and her throat, that Valerie met Ethan in the first-floor corridor. He was coming from the study with a folder under his arm and his hair slightly disheveled, with that energy of someone who has been working for hours on something that matters to him. He stopped when he saw her. "Did you talk to her?" "Yes." And I said yes. Something in Ethan's expression settled in the same way. A slightly crooked painting suddenly finds its correct place on the wall. Without drama, without emphasis, just the quiet satisfaction of things being where they should be. "Good," he said. And then, before continuing down the corridor, "Valerie." "Yes." He said it slowly, with the care of someone choosing words, not out of difficulty, but out of respect for their own weight. "Thank you." It wasn't a formal phrase. It was exactly what it was. 2 words that carried the weight of everything that had happened in recent weeks and needed no more. "You're welcome," Valerie said. And the two continued on their paths down the corridor of Vance Manor, in a direction that was still to be fully defined, but which somehow, at that moment, already had the right shape. The months that followed brought a normalcy that at first felt strange after so much tension, and which then settled into something that closely resembled the life that should have been happening in that house long before. Eleanor recovered completely. There was nothing to recover in a medical sense. Her health had always been what her own clinical notes described, robust for her age, with the reasonable vigilance required by any 7-4-year-old. But there was something to recover in another sense, the right to move freely in her own home, without measuring every gesture, without wondering if the next signature someone put in front of her was what it claimed to be. That right, which should never have been lost, became hers again with the same naturalness with which the garden produces new flowers after a rainy season. She went out to the garden in the afternoons. Valerie often found her there, sitting on the stone bench by the fountain with a book or without one, looking at the bougainvillea or the dogwood or the sky over New York City, with that expression of someone who has lived 74 years well and knows the difference between looking and seeing. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. Both things were equally comfortable. The process against Richard took, as Mr. Sterling had warned, its own time. But time was not on his side. The lawyers he hired, and he hired good ones, with the last resources he could gather from accounts that the judicial audit hadn't managed to block yet, found that the evidence gathered in the blue notebook, combined with Dr. Hayes's statement, Texarkana Real Estate's records, and the forensic examination of the forged signature, formed a chain that was very difficult to argue against, without each argument producing more inconvenient questions. Richard was sentenced 17 months after the meeting in the boardroom for aggravated fraud and forgery of documents. The sentence included the restitution of all diverted assets to the family estate, considerable civil restrictions, and a suspended sentence conditioned on compliance with restitution agreements that Mr. Sterling negotiated with the same precision with which he did everything else. Eleanor did not go to the district attorney's office on the day of the sentencing. She stayed home. That afternoon, when Valerie went up with the 6 o'clock tea, a habit that had settled between the two of them, without either formally proposing it, she found her in the armchair by the window, the book closed on her knees, her eyes on the garden. "Do you know already?" Valerie asked, placing the tray on the nightstand. "Ethan called me an hour ago." "How are you, ma'am?" Eleanor considered the question for a moment. "Sad," she said. "How one is when something you expected to be different turns out to be exactly what it was." A pause. "Richard was my son before he was what he turned out to be. That doesn't get cancelled. It just gets carried." Valerie said nothing. Some things don't need an answer, only presence. She sat in the armchair opposite Eleanor, as on so many afternoons before, and the two looked at the garden together. As the afternoon light grew more golden and still on the bougainvillea, and the fountain, and the dogwood, which by then had new, pale lilac flowers trembling slightly in the wind. The day Valerie started her first semester of law school at New York University, with a partial scholarship, Mr. Sterling managed with the same efficiency with which he managed everything, and the compliment Eleanor had promised without making a big deal out of it. She arrived at the manor that afternoon with new books under her arm, and a feeling she took a moment to identify, because it wasn't completely familiar. It was pride, yes, but not the pride of having won something. It was the calmer, more solid pride of someone starting something that should have started earlier, and who now knew that time hadn't been lost, but accumulated in another form. Al was waiting for her at the gate with the thermos. "How was it?" "Good. A little hard." And Valerie smiled. A real smile, without layers or measurements, the kind one allows oneself when one is in a place where one can afford them. "And I stayed anyway." Al nodded with that honest mustache and that economy of 11 years in front of the gate. "Of course you did." It was a Tuesday in March, almost a year after the gala night, when Ethan asked her if she wanted to have dinner with him. It wasn't an elaborate question. It wasn't a designed scene. It was in the first-floor corridor when they crossed paths, after she came down from the weekly meeting with Eleanor, and he came up from the study with the same folder under his arm. And he stopped and said with the direct simplicity that was his natural way, "Dinner with me tonight. There's a place in Williamsburg I want to try, and I'd rather not go alone." Valerie looked at him. She thought of all the distances that existed between them, the distances the world had built very carefully for a very long time. The surname, the money, the manner, the gray apron. She thought of how many of those distances were still standing, and how many had been dissolving without anyone naming them, in the space of a year of shared work and difficult truths navigated together, and of afternoons in the corridors of a house that somehow, without anyone planning it, had become something resembling a home for the two of them. She also thought of her Grandma Rose, of the cracks, of the light. "Yes," she said. It wasn't a telenovela ending in the literal sense of the word. There was no background music, no close-up on the leading man's face, none of the scenes that stories of that genre build with such care. It was something closer to real life, which arrives unannounced and without gilded frames, but which, when it is finally there, has a solidity no constructed stage could have. What there was, 8 months after that first dinner in Williamsburg, was a small, very small wedding in the garden of Vance Manor on a Saturday in November, with that dry season sun that in New York City has the specific clarity of things that last. Clean, without excess, completely real. The guests were few. Mr. Sterling, who arrived with a gift that was evidently a book, which surprised no one. Al, who arrived in his guard uniform because he had no other formal attire, and who turned out to be the person who cried the most of all, with that honest cry only allowed by someone who has no reason to pretend not to feel what they feel. Mrs. Holloway, who prepared the banquet herself with the efficiency of 22 years and didn't let anyone into the kitchen to help her, because help in the kitchen only gets in the way. Some classmates from Valerie's law school, some of Ethan's friends from his European period who arrived on different flights and shared a quiet astonishment, like someone who knows another for years and suddenly sees them in a moment of light that completely defines them. And Eleanor sitting in the place of honor under the dogwood tree in bloom. November was not its season, but that year the tree had bloomed again, out of season and without explanation, in that capricious way trees sometimes have of doing what they want. With her taupe suit and her dark wood cane and her amber eyes more alive than Valerie had ever seen them, she wasn't crying. She was watching with that gaze. Valerie now knew, the one that sees and names at the same time, the one that records important things, without needing an archive, because she keeps them in a place deeper and more permanent than any drawer or folder or safe deposit box. When the moment came, and Valerie passed by her on her way to the small improvised altar between the bougainvillea and the fountain, Eleanor extended her hand and took hers for exactly 3 seconds. She said nothing. It wasn't necessary. In those 3 seconds was everything. The gala night and the hand stopped in mid-air, and the blue notebook, and the tea afternoons by the window, and the light that enters through the cracks, and the 17 months of legal process, and the first day of law school, and the dinner in Williamsburg, and the 8 months that had slowly and carefully built what that November morning was being named aloud under a dogwood tree, in unseasonable bloom. Valerie squeezed her hand and kept walking. That night, long after the guests had left and the house had regained its usual quiet, Valerie went out into the garden alone. It was late. The city at night has its own sound, distant, constant, like a river that never stops. And the garden under that sound was a space that belonged to another time scale, slower, deeper, more like things that last. She sat on the stone bench by the fountain. She thought of her Grandma Rose, of the small apartment, and the problems folded like laundry, and the cracks where light enters. She thought of 14 years of work, and the blue notebook and the night she stopped a hand in mid-air, without knowing exactly where it would lead her. The stone fountain continued its murmur. The bougainvillea were dark magenta in the light of the security lamps. The dogwood, now without flowers again, awaited its next season with the quiet patience of trees that know they will return. Valerie Davis Vance, since that morning. Although the name still felt a little big, like new clothes one buys, knowing that with time they will mold to the body, she breathed the air of the garden she had pruned and watered and cared for over a year. And she thought that her grandmother was right. The cracks exist, and through them, if one learns to look, exactly enough light enters.